The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. Welcome to unit number 4, wherever you are. So just want to do a quick sound check if I may. Could I just ask if you could just go to the question box on the right-hand side and just type in the word clear. That just lets me know that I'm great. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Colleen. Thanks, Marco. Thanks, John. Excellent. All right, looks like it is coming across loud and clear, which is great. All right, I'm going to try and finish, if I may, a little bit earlier than the scheduled time of 1:30, only because I've got to go. Silly me, I booked another meeting straight after this, but no breathing space, so I've just got to go straight from this to another meeting. So apologies about that in advance, but never mind, we're going to get through all the material without a problem. Okay, so we're going to look at the interesting topic today about getting the very best out of your people, and it's obviously a challenge that all of us have got. What can we do, or what do we not have to do in order to get people to perform at an optimal level? So I'm going to share with you a couple of very useful strategies, I think, to help you with that. So let's move on. So you can see now where we're up to in the cycle of the units, and we've got through feedback. We've looked at influencing capabilities. I got you to optimize team performance by having more conversations, so I hope they're happening. And today we're going to look at that individual component, which is about getting the very best from the people that you lead. We'll leave the other two until we get to that point. All right, so I would argue, and I think with some justification, that your primary role as a leader is to get the very best from each of your members, each of your team members. To me, that's the ultimate aim of being a leader. Not an easy thing to do, but I think that is the key to your success. Now, the question is, how do you go about that, and what are you aiming to do? Well, the how I'll talk about in a moment, but let's talk about what you're aiming to do. Now, if you could rate your people on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of their, performance, you might rate one a 7 out of 10, another one a 4 out of 10, perhaps another one a 3 out of 10. And of course, those numbers will fluctuate depending on what projects you're working on, what time of the day it is, the mood they're in, how you're feeling, all sorts of things. But I think it's unrealistic to expect that we're going to get people, say, a 3 out of a 10 to a 10 out of a 10. So I think the first thing we've got to do is temper our expectations. What you should be aiming to do is to get that 10% improvement in performance from each person. So in other words, how do you get the 3 to a 4? How do you get the 4 to a 5? How do you get the 5 to a 6? How do you get the 6 to a 7, and so forth? Now, you might think, well, that's not much, and I came here today expecting more. Well, if you get a 10% improvement in productivity from each person in your team, and let's say you've got a team of, say, 6, for example, we're talking a substantial increase exponentially of 60+% across the team. That will make a significant difference. So I just want you to think about it from the perspective of how I can get people to give that little extra discretionary effort, not so much how do we get everyone to be a 10 out of 10 and a pace setter like yourself. That's not necessarily what I'm aiming to do, and I don't think it's necessarily realistic either. So that's the first important point out of all of this. So what we're going to cover in this is I'm going to talk a little bit about the myths around motivation, because there are a lot of myths about motivation generally, and I think we need to dispel those up front. I want to share with you some research that talks about what people actually want in their job. And, I think it's quite interesting, the research actually, and show you some very interesting feedback. I want to talk about the concept of job and non-job tasks. And, I think there's some real relevance of that in the work that we do. And then ultimately, before we finish up, I just want to share with you some models of motivation that you might find interesting. So we're covering a lot in a short amount of time. So the first thing I want to do is just define what we mean by motivation, because we hear this word all the time and I wonder what it really means. And I think what it really means is that there are three dimensions to motivation. So what that means is that, you know, forces within an individual that account for the level, direction and persistence of effort expended at work. So these are internal forces. These are things that occur inside the person. And there are three areas or dimensions, if you like, that are really important. So one of the dimensions is the direction. So where a person chooses to expend their energy when they've got several options. So, for example, if in a very practical sense, if people have got 10 things to do, of those 10 things, what choice do they make as to which of those 10 things they do? That is one dimension of motivation. So it's about the priorities that they set in the work that they do. And you would know this, that some people have real trouble working out what their priorities are. So that's one dimension. Another dimension is the persistence that people put in, and that is what we might call stickability. That is the ability to get on and get the job done no matter what the circumstances are, no matter what the pressures are, we get it done. And that's probably a more traditional definition of motivation. And obviously, the longer somebody sticks at something, the more likely they are to be persistent, and therefore that definition has been covered. Now, the third dimension is the level. That's the level of intensity. So someone can be very persistent, for example, but not have a lot of intensity, and other people can be quite intense for a short period of time. So intensity is the effort put forth by the person. So I share this with you because I think it's important for you to think when you see somebody that lacks motivation for whatever reason, instead of just sort of, you know, making the comment that they lack motivation, or thinking it at least, think for a moment, is it the direction, in other words, the priorities, is it the persistence that they put in, or is it the level of intensity? Which of those three are lacking? Now, you might say all three, but at least if I've got one of those that I ask that question, I can then start to address that in more detail. So, for example, if it's direction, then I can sit down with that individual and realign their priorities with the priorities of the work unit that they are part of. So, you know, I have much more targeted opportunity to talk to people than I would if I just, you know, made the sweeping statement that they just lack motivation. So let me now talk about some of the myths around motivation, and some of these are a little controversial, some of them are fairly straightforward, but let's have a look at one. The first important thing, and I've been alluding to this already so far in the broadcast, is that you can't motivate anyone. I can't motivate you, you can't motivate anyone. What that means, of course, is that it is an inside job. People are able to do that themselves. All we can do is to provide the environment or circumstances for people to do that. That's important to think about, because what it ultimately means is that the individual has a responsibility to be motivated, but then again, we have a responsibility to create an environment where they may choose to be motivated. But I found that very liberating because for me, I thought I could motivate people, and I was working on that myth that you could motivate people. You can't. It's their decision. It's a choice that people make. So that's one myth. Another myth is that ultimately everyone is motivated, but they're not necessarily inspired. So we often make generalizations and say that person's more motivated than this person, whatever. We're all motivated. Just getting out of bed this morning and coming to work is, in a sense, a motivation. Not a very big one, but it's still one. We've all got motivation. It's just that sometimes we're not inspired by what we do. So I think that's important, because we can get this, we can work on the assumption that, you know, it's impossible to get that person motivated, but this person over here, it's impossible for them to be nothing but motivated. So we can't generalize like that. Thirdly, it's a completely subjective view, of course, and what that means is that what motivates one person may not necessarily have any impact on another. And that's important, because what often happens as a leader is we decide what motivates us, and then ultimately we expect that that's going to work for everybody else. For example, I love a challenge. And so therefore I would often use challenges to try to motivate people, and find that people just did not respond very well to that. And there's good reason, because it wasn't their thing. It was mine, but it wasn't theirs. So it made a big difference. So that's another myth. Another myth is that intrinsic motivation is more powerful than extrinsic motivation. Now, what that means, of course, is that, as I said earlier, it's an inside job. So what it ultimately means is that, as recruiters will often say to you, you're better off finding somebody that's motivated, or at least has a sense of motivation about them, than to try to motivate someone. So it's true that it's an inside job. And so all of these kind of things that we have in the workplace, all these extrinsic rewards and so forth, aren't necessarily all that effective. Or certainly not as effective as the intrinsic motivation. In other words, people doing it for their own reason and not any other reason. Money is overestimated as a motivational force. Now, research has shown this, and the most famous research there was through Hertzberg's research on money. Ultimately, money to a point is important, obviously. If we didn't get paid, we probably wouldn't be inclined to come to work. But to a point, it's important, but beyond that, it's not really. So, in other words, if you actually could double people's salary, would you get double the effort? You may initially, but I suspect what would happen is that people would fall back to old habits and just so money is overestimated. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm just saying that it's often overestimated, and so as a result of that, it's not always as what it's cracked up to be as a motivational force. And everybody is actually motivated by the pain pleasure principle, and what that simply means is that people will do everything they can to seek pleasure and avoid pain. In other words, everything we say, think, and do ultimately is about seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, which sounds very simplistic until you consider that every one of us actually considers pain and pleasure differently. We conceptualize it differently. So what might be painful for me might be pleasurable for you. We all interpret it in different ways, and therein lies the complexity. That's the, getting out of bed in the morning might be painful for someone, whereas for another person saying, if I sleep in, it'll be painful. In other words, I'll let someone down at work or whatever. So it's an interesting concept. So I just wanted to set the scene before we moved on to anything else, to say that there are a whole lot of important myths that we need to consider before we go any further. Now, we did some surveys, and this came from the Boston Consulting Group, which is fairly relevant, and it's fairly recent as well. And what I'd like to do is share with you what their research was. Now, while I'm doing this, I want you to type in what you think was the number one thing that employees want in their job. Now, I want you to think about that. Now, here's what happened. They surveyed 9,000 people across 4 different continents, across 21 industries. They asked them a simple question. They said, look, if there was one thing that was important to you in your work, what would it be? That was the question. And of course, the person would write it down on a piece of paper. And it was, so this is a frequency survey. So they collected all this data. And of course, what they did is then, the person, the one that had the most got number 1, the one that had the second most, number 2, and so forth. So what I'm curious about is just to see where you're at with this. And I'd like you in the question box over on the right-hand side, have a go, just see how close you are. What would you say would be the number one thing? Making a meaningful contribution, says Stephen. Thank you, Stephen. I'll just give others a chance to type in what they might perceive to be. Equity, says Jennifer. Yeah, what else? Anyone else? What's the number one thing that people want in their work? Recognition, says Ben. Okay. Anyone else? Training and development, says Marsha. Okay. Anyone else? Happy workplace, says Colleen. Okay. Good. Look, many of those things are in the survey results. Let's have a look at number one on the list. Number one on the list, ta-da, is work-life balance. Now, you might have been surprised when you saw that. I don't know whether you were, but this was number one out of 9,000 people who entered into this survey. And if you think about it, you know, we're often in a, you know, relationship. One partner, both partners have to work. We've got to juggle family and household and all these other things. So there's a whole lot of things that have to be done. So you can imagine that work-life balance and the opportunity to be flexible in the workplace is now number one, certainly in this survey at least. Number two on the list was that, and I found this very interesting, that the relationships they have with their colleagues is important. So in other words, you know, they don't have to be best friends, but just have good constructive working relationships with their colleagues is really important. So that became number two on the list. Remember, I'm not making this up. I'm just reporting the Boston Consulting Group's results. Then it was relationship with the manager. That's you. So this is about the ability to have a good working relationship with their boss. And you hear these surveys, or you hear commentary around people don't leave jobs, they leave bosses. And I think people don't leave organisations, they leave bosses. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And often when you hear in exit interviews, you often hear people talking about, I had an altercation with my boss. Number four on the list is being appreciated. Okay, this is similar to some of the ones that you mentioned, which is important. And so, being appreciated is important. Very true. Sometimes this does not come easy for some, says Jennifer. Yeah, okay. And that's the relationship part I'm sure you're talking about, Jennifer. Just getting general appreciation doesn't mean people have to make a song and a dance about it. But I think ultimately what it means is that people must feel that their work is being recognised by those around them. Number five on the list, financial stability of the employer. So that makes sense, I guess, that they don't want the employer to go under. Obviously, if it's a public sector organisation, it's not likely to go under. But if it's a public sector organisation, a private sector organisation, they want to know that it's going to be around for a year or two at least and growing, I guess. So that was an important consideration. And of course, 5 and 6 are related in some respects. So job security was very important for people at number 6. Interesting work at number 7. So people wanted some variety and interest in their work, which I think is very interesting in itself. So people don't want to be just doing the old, mundane, drudgery type work. They want to be doing something with a little bit of interest and excitement involved. Number 8, they want, and one of you mentioned this, learning and development. So they want to have the opportunity to grow and develop as an individual and also, of course, as a job holder. So that becomes really important that be on the list as well. Number 9 is that they want to know what the values of the employer are. So this is becoming interesting over the last 10, 15, maybe even 20 years. This is becoming a really important thing. And it's not unusual for people being interviewed for jobs to actually ask the interviewer about the values of the organisation. And so this is something that would not have happened 40 years ago, but now it's very commonplace that people would talk about those things. And last but not least on the list is career development. People want to feel as if they'll have an opportunity to grow and develop in their career so that it will assist them in future, I guess, to look for future employment opportunities, whether it's there or in other places. So there's the list, folks. It's pretty interesting, isn't it? Now, that's just one list, but let's face it, 9,000 people across several cultures and across 21 industries is a pretty good sample. And so I think you'll find that that list would not be the same list that was around 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I think you'd find work-life balance wouldn't have even been on the list in the last century. So it's very interesting how things change, and they continue to change. So here's a question that I've got for you. Now, if you, just moving on, if you have one person who is just not motivated, what do you do? So what would you do if you're faced with one person in your team who just doesn't seem to be motivated? What would you do, or what can you do? And here's my answer. Ask. Ask. What do you ask? Well, you ask this question. And this is a simple question that any of us can do. And the question is this: is there anything that I'm doing or not doing that can help you to be more engaged in your work? Now, it's an innocent enough question, and it's a good question, and I think that often we don't ask those sort of questions. That could open up a really interesting dialogue, which could start to explain certain things. So yeah, I know it takes a bit of courage to ask that question, but in the right circumstances, it's a good question to ask, and I think you'll find that you will get plenty to work with on that sort of thing. Now, you might say, well, it's based on the assumption that the person is disengaged. Well, they probably are, and they know they're disengaged. You know they're disengaged. Everyone they work with knows they're disengaged, so it's no great mystery. You might as well get it out there. And by asking this sort of question, you're making an assumption that there's something that you may or may not do that has an impact on that. But you're not necessarily letting the person off the hook, but it's a good starting point. Now let's talk about job and non-job roles. And this is some work that came out of my book that I wrote in 2015, as you can see on there, called The End of the Job Description. You could probably understand what I think about job descriptions. And I want to explain something to you because I think it gives some huge insight into performance. So this is original stuff, and let me have a look and show you. If you look at work, it's two-dimensional, arguably. The first dimension is that people have a job to do, right? And normally that job is a number of technical skills that they've got and tasks. And normally that job is written up as a job description, all right? So there's no great mystery there. We know that. But the argument I'd make here is it's only one dimension of performance. The other dimension of performance is very rarely discussed, let alone formally documented. And this is where I think the biggest problems occur in the workplace. The other dimension is non-job roles. So these are roles that people perform that aren't directly related to their job description, that nevertheless are important in the work they do. Now, for 25 years, people have been running around trying to work out what they are, and they'd argue that they're not generic. You can't, work out what these non-job roles are and how they relate to all industries. So I took a stab at it in 2015, and I came up with 4 that I believe are critically important. And I would argue that these 4 would fit your organisation. I have no doubt about that because I think they're sufficiently generic to do that. The first non-job role that I indicated in my book was to have a positive attitude and enthusiasm role. Now, I don't expect people to come to work bouncing off the walls with excitement. That's not the sort of thing I'm talking about. But on the other hand, I don't expect people to come to work whinging and whining and complaining and undermining. All of that stuff, in my view, is completely and utterly unnecessary. Moreover, it's completely and utterly counterproductive, and it does impact on performance, doesn't it? Or those around, apart from the person doing it themselves. But when was the last time you spoke to someone about something like that? Probably not, I suspect, because you're too worried about being too subjective and too personal. And yet we would argue that attitude is critically important to people's success. Here's another non-job role. Being a team player. Now, we expect people to be able to work in teams, but it staggers me to think of the number of people that have mentioned to their boss that they're not team players. I come to work, I do my job, I'm not a team player, And so it doesn't say anywhere in my job description that I need to be a team player. Well, actually, it may not, but you need to be that. Number 3 on the list, excuse me for a moment. Number 3 on the list is career role. We expect people to grow and develop in their role. Now, what I mean by that is that there are plenty of people that stop growing. You know, they get their job, they, you know, and they just that's all they think they need to do, and they don't want to do any more. Well, that in my view is completely inappropriate. So what we want them to do is to continually grow and develop. But again, how often do you see in the workforce people saying, oh, I'm too old to go to that training course, or I've been used to using this spreadsheet for years, I don't want to change. Well, in my view, that's non-negotiable, because obviously if people don't want to try and develop and grow in role, they're really going backwards, because the rest of the world is moving forward. So that's an issue. And then the final one is innovation and continuous improvement. We expect people to come to work to bring their ideas and their thoughts and how they can improve and make the workplace more efficient and effective. We expect that, or I do at least, and you should. But how often do people do that? So if you look at the 5 conversations framework that I spoke about a fortnight ago, you'll notice that conversation number 5 is on innovation and continuous improvement. If you're prepared to have those conversations with people, then there's no choice but people to start talking about ways and means of making the workplace more efficient and effective. So can you imagine what your workplace would be like if everyone had a rotten attitude, they weren't team players, they'd stopped growing, and they'd stopped coming to work with ideas and thoughts? I don't think it would be a great place to work. I'm sure you would agree. So those become very important. Colleen just mentions here positive attitude. Sometimes when a person walks in the door, you know, yeah, look, I agree with you. But look, I also think that some people don't understand that it's their response. I mean, we all have bad days, don't we? I mean, I accept all that. I'm not suggesting we need to be robots, but we all have bad days. But for someone to habitually come to work every day whinging and whining and complaining, it's just not on. I would have no hesitation, if I was in your position, to have a conversation or 2 or 3 with that person about that, because it's not helping you. And if anything, you're going 1 step forward and they're taking you 2 steps back. It's not a good place to be. So I strongly recommend that you talk to them about those things. It's really important to do that. Thanks, Colleen, for the comment. Now I want to just talk about, I'm just mindful of time, although we're making pretty good time. And if you've got questions, I'm not going to discourage you from asking them. But Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I'm going to just share with you a couple of models that I think are quite useful for you to think about in terms of the way you might get the best out of people. The Maslow's hierarchy of needs has been around for a long time. I think Abraham Maslow, industrial psychologist, was around the 1930s. He went out to a restaurant for lunch and he drew this pyramid on a napkin, would you believe? And he was quite surprised at how incredibly, it just took off, basically. People, I'm talking to you about it now. I mean, he's long dead. So it just gained a huge amount of interest. And so the big weakness of it is it hasn't actually been empirically researched, but I think it makes perfect sense that what he basically is saying is that there is a series of needs that we have as human beings that when those needs have been fulfilled, they no longer become a need. In other words, they no longer become a motivational driver. So at the bottom of the pyramid there, you've got physiological needs. That's air, food, and water. So that's the most fundamental need that human beings have. Now, people aren't interested in anything else unless they've got food, water, so forth, because that's survival is number one. Now, in our society, except for, an unfortunate group of people that we need to give careful consideration to, most of us, of course, are okay with that. So we've got all those things met, most of us, not all of us. Now, once those things are met, we then need to feel safe, both physically and psychologically. So we don't want to be hit by some falling object at work, and by the same token, we don't want to be bullied at work in a psychological way. So that's why we have all of those rules. So safety is important. So those two things, by and large, not always, have been met before people. So they're not really drivers. They're just people just expect those things. Now, the next three are critically important to you as a leader, because people, the first thing they want when they come to a workplace, according to Maslow, is they want to feel a sense of belonging. They want to feel that they belong. And of course, when you turn up to a new job, you don't automatically think that you belong. You'd like to think you do, but the proof isn't in yet. So you need to feel a sense of belonging. In other words, in a meeting, you're asked a question. People genuinely seek out your opinions. People actually, come up to your workstation or knock on the door of your office and ask you these sorts of questions. These things are indicators of belonging. So the first key challenge for you and your teams is to make sure that everybody in that team feels that they belong to the team. And there's lots of interesting ways of doing that. Then once they feel that they belong, it no longer becomes a motivational influence. The next thing is they need to feel a sense of esteem. They need to feel that their opinion is important and that they are accomplishing certain things. So this is where recognition, this is where positive feedback comes in. It's really important to do that in order for people to feel that. Now, for a select few, they get to what's called self-actualization. Now, self-actualization is where people need to feel as if they're growing and developing and stretching day by day, that this is something that and of course, if they don't, they get bored and they leave. Now, the big mistake I made I don't make anymore, but I'm at the top of that apex in lots of cases. I'm at that sort of wanting to grow, stretch and develop. I make the false assumption that other people are like that as well. So here am I trying to challenge people when in actual fact they don't feel that they even belong, or they don't feel that they've even been recognised for the accomplishments that they've already made. And here am I challenging them. So you can see how there can be a discord between what I think people need and what they actually need. So that's one theory you might like to have a look at. It's very simple to understand and it's very easy to implement. Now, Douglas McGregor came up with an interesting theory called the Theory X and Theory Y. This is a very busy slide and I won't bore you with all the detail. It's pretty straightforward. Basically, McGregor was one of the first psychologists to come up with the view that the manager has certain assumptions about human nature. And because they have certain assumptions about human nature, they will act accordingly. And he said that there were two basic assumptions that people had about human nature. There was a theory X and a theory Y. Now, a theory X manager is somebody who believes that employees dislike work, they have to be forced into compliance, they need direction, they will avoid responsibility if they can. They're motivated by fear. They lack, and they're, things like job security. They have very little creativity except getting around the rules. Now, that's a pretty dim view of somebody's view of human nature, but I will guarantee to you that many of you in this broadcast have had a manager at some stage in your career who you could classify as a Theory X manager. And it's not a very pleasant experience. I am one of those that have had a manager like that. It isn't pleasant. They always second guess you. They micromanage you. They don't expect that they always underestimate your ability to get the job done. That's not a good place to be. Then McGregor talked about a theory Y manager, which is the exact opposite. So a theory Y manager is the other end of the continuum. A theory Y manager is a manager who believes that people need to work, who enjoy it, who will direct themselves towards an accepted target. They'll thrive on responsibility. They'll be motivated by a desire for self-development. They'll be highly creative. Now, you might say, well, I'm somewhere in between. It's certainly better to be on the right-hand side than the left-hand side if you're really looking at creating a motivational environment for people to prosper. Definitely theory Y is the way to go. So you might want to think that through. I suspect that most of you would be able to empathise with the theory Y manager more than the X, I'm sure. Now, there was Daniel Pink wrote a great book called Drive. It's a great book if you want to get a good read on motivation. And he ultimately came up from his research that there were 3 important things that knowledge workers needed in order for them to be motivated. And let me talk about what he came up with. He basically said that the carrot and the stick, that is rewards and punishment, is no longer a relevant way to create the motivational environment for knowledge workers. He did say, however, that the carrot and the stick can be very useful for semi-skilled and unskilled workers. But in terms of people who've got a high education level who are dealing with perhaps, more than routine type of tasks, he believed that it was not only was it not working, he felt it was actually counterproductive. So he argued, and argues strongly in the book, and it's, as I said, it's a great read. He suggested that the knowledge worker needed 3 key things. They need autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So autonomy is that people want to feel that they have some say and control over the work that they do. So this is about making decisions about, priorities. This is about deciding how to tackle a project. This is about deciding, when to collaborate with others and when not to. So having that autonomy. So clearly a micromanager or that theory X manager I talked about would obviously not be able to provide that, because you've got to obviously trust people to a certain degree, don't you, to give them that autonomy. The second thing that Daniel Pink said is that people need to feel that they have mastery. Now, mastery means that they feel that they are continuing to grow and develop. And you might cast your mind back to that list of 10 things I showed you earlier. There's no doubt that there were 2, if not 3 or 4 things on that list which were very much around learning and development and career development. So that's where that comes in. So if we don't train people and give people opportunities to learn and grow, it's likely that that will be actually demotivating for them. And the third thing, which I think is often underestimated, that Pink talks about, is purpose. So his argument is that we need to explain the why. Simon Sinek talks about the why of work. We need to explain to people, why do we need this report? Why is it important? Who gets hold of it? And all that sort of thing. So we've got to actually explain the rationale behind what we do. The big danger that leaders make is they assume that other people actually get the big picture. Well, they don't, not always. And I think it's a very dangerous assumption to make. I think our job is that we need to explain to people, whenever we get the chance, of either, one, how someone else will benefit from this mundane piece of work that you're doing, or 2, what the drawbacks would be if that work was not done effectively. So in other words, there are benefits there for other people to take on board. So that's something you might like to think about. It's a great model because it's easy to understand, makes perfect sense, and I think people can relate to it very well. All right, so Whoops, we're coming towards the end now. The last slide I wanted to share with any questions or comments about that, folks? Does that all make sense? Is it clear what I'm getting at around, I'm trying to bring this down to a couple of very practical things that I think will work for you to create that environment. Bear in mind that no matter what you do, it'll be ultimately the decision of the person on the receiving end as to whether or not they become motivated. That's their choice, not yours. All you can do is create the environment. So what I've got here on the list here, I've got a series of things just to wrap all this up nicely for you today, and just say to you, here is a series of things that if you do these things, then you are doing everything right in order to create the environment that will be able to perhaps potentially motivate other people, or for them to make that decision to be motivated. So one of the things that's important is to clarify the task. So what is it we expect you to do? And in that, of course, also is the why of why we're asking you to do it, and not to make the assumption, of course, that it's obvious. Going across the page, there's that word again, feedback. So people who receive frequent feedback, particularly positive feedback, are likely to be engaged and motivated. So I hope you're continuing your feedback in the workplace, because it is really, really important to do that. Show people how they can contribute. Now, that is very much around the why of work that we talked about before, and this is about explaining to people the difference that their work makes. What I found interesting is that I did some work in a local government environment in Queensland. I won't mention who it was. We've got some people, I think, in the webinar who are in local government. I'm not going to mention the name, but anyway, the point was that I spoke to the outdoor staff, and I simply asked them, that's the people working on the roads and working in the parks and gardens and things like that. And I said to them, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? And got everyone to write that down on a piece of paper anonymously, hand it in to me. I came back with a score of 6.2. That was the average score. I went into the indoor staff. These are the people working on computers and producing reports and crunching numbers. And I asked them on a scale of 1 to 10 how they would rate their job satisfaction. And I got, interesting enough, a 5.9. So there was an appreciable difference between the indoor and the outdoor staff's level of motivation. I asked the outdoor staff, followed that up, and I said, why is it that you get satisfaction out of the work you do? And I'll never forget, one of them said, it's because we can see the pothole we've filled, or we can see the bridge we've built, or we can see the garden that we've mowed. We can actually tangibly see what we've done differently. And I thought that was a brilliant explanation as to the fact that people need to see the big picture of what they're doing. Anyway, moving on, encouraging personal goal clarification, so getting people to set their own personal goals. This is around this autonomy from Daniel Pink's work. Matching jobs with personal motives, again, around Daniel Pink's work, around autonomy. If we can give people that freedom and choice to do that, we can't always, I know that, but when we can, it's good. Make apparent the personal and team gains in terms of doing it right. Recognise individual success, so there goes feedback again. And you might notice that recognition was on the list of top 10 things that people wanted out of their job. Remove organisational roadblocks. Your job is, wherever possible, to do what you can to remove things that are going to get in the way of people being able to achieve success. Some things can't be moved, but others can, and you need to get involved in that. But the other thing that's important there is to remove supervisory roadblocks. Now, what I mean by that is, the truth is, there are things, no doubt, that you are doing or not doing which may well in their own right be roadblocks. So you've got to be brutally honest with yourself and look in the mirror and think, well, what am I doing or not doing that's actually making the job harder, not easier? And remember, the question I asked earlier is, you can ask anyone. You could say to somebody, what is it I'm doing or not doing that could make a difference? And I think, if you're prepared to ask that question, you may well get a response back that may be helpful for you. So you're asking for feedback, in other words. So, folks, that's about it from me. As I said earlier, I wanted to finish a bit earlier because I'm going straight into another presentation, and silly me didn't put enough time buffer between my events, but I certainly didn't want to change our lunch and learn time because I thought, that would put you out. So I thought, well, the best compromise is for me to try and get through all the material before I start the next thing. So any last questions that anyone wants to ask, or any comments or observations that anyone has in relation to the material that I've run through today? All right, here's your homework. Your homework is, I want you to use autonomy, mastery, and purpose in your leadership decision making and conversations, and stick with it no matter what. I want you to consider these three things. How can I give people a little bit more autonomy? How can I help people improve their mastery of what they're doing? And how can I explain the purpose of what we're doing more clearly to people so that it engages them more in the line of sight between what they do and the end result? So, folks, that's it from me. I'll sign out there if I may. I don't think we've got any questions or comments. All good? Okay. I just want to make sure. Yep, no, all good. Okay, well, of course, you can contact me on email if you need to as well, because I'm happy for you to do that. So, folks, that's it from me. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the week, and we'll catch up. And by the way, there'll be a little diagnostic I'd suggest you do for the next one, which will be in 2 weeks' time, on understanding people and their personality. So thank you, folks, and have a great rest of the week and have a fantastic weekend. We'll catch up in a fortnight. Thank you and goodbye.